Do you know that feeling when you walk through a place that was once your entire world and you suddenly realize you become a ghost in it? The coffee tastes different. The hum from the server room sounds less like progress and more like a countdown. For 15 years, this company was my life's work. I wasn't just an employee. My name was etched onto the founding license of its $300 million operation, the Bedrock. But a new head of human resources saw that name as just a line item to be deleted. He thought it held no value. He was about to get a very expensive education in contract law. So if you're watching this, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. My name is Sarah Connolly, and for the last 15 years I have been the head of research and development at a company I helped build from a single idea sketched on a napkin. That idea was about creating sustainable energy solutions that were not just profitable but genuinely good for the planet. In the early days, we were a small team fueled by late nights, cheap pizza, and the belief that we were creating something that mattered. We weren't just colleagues. We were believers in a shared vision, and our work reflected that passion. That shared belief was the engine that grew our little startup into a major player in the green energy sector. Then came the acquisition. A larger corporation bought us, and while they kept the name, they slowly replaced the soul of the company with a spreadsheet. The new chief executive officer, a man named Peterson, whom I'd only seen in polished corporate videos, spoke a different language. It was a language of key performance indicators, of optimizing operational efficiency, of shareholder value above all else. Our mission to innovate for the planet was reframed into developing intellectual property that could be monetized. The passion was gone, replaced by a relentless focus on quarterly earnings reports. My role, once central to the company's future, began to feel ceremonial. I was the ghost in the foundation. My invitations to strategic planning meetings became optional. My detailed reports on long-term research projects were met with automated email replies. And my budget for new exploratory science was frozen indefinitely. I was being erased quietly, methodically, not with a loud declaration of war, but with the silent creeping indifference of 1,000 small cuts. The person orchestrating this slow fade was Mark, the new head of human resources. He was a man who saw people not as assets but as liabilities to be managed. One Tuesday morning I was walking back from the coffee station navigating the familiar maze of cubicles. As I passed the main conference room with its floor-to-ceiling glass walls, I saw Peterson, the chief executive officer, standing inside with Mark. They were looking at a large screen displaying a new organizational chart. My eyes immediately found the section highlighted in a stark, unforgiving red. It was my entire department, my team of brilliant scientists. I stopped for just a moment, partially hidden by a large potted plant that the new management had installed for employee wellness. I watched as Mark spoke to Peterson, his expression confident and dismissive. He gestured towards that red section on the screen, the box that contained my life's work. And though the glass was thick, I was close enough to see his lips form the words with perfect clarity. Her entire department is a memory, he said. Her name is just a legacy signature. It holds no value now. A chill went through me, but it wasn't one of sadness or fear. It was the cold, sharp clarity of a final truth revealed. They didn't just see me as obsolete. They saw the very foundation I had built as worthless. They had forgotten that a legacy signature etched onto the right document holds the most value of all. I didn't react. I didn't let the shock register on my face. I just walked back to my office, the quiet hum of the servers that I had helped install suddenly sounding less like progress and more like a countdown. The rest of the day passed in a strange heightened awareness. The countdown I felt wasn't one of panic, but of cold anticipation. I didn't spend my time mourning my position. I spent it archiving 15 years of my research notes, separating my personal intellectual contributions from company assets. I was simply preparing for a departure I knew was coming long before I read it on Mark's lips. The formal summons arrived after lunch. Its subject line a masterpiece of corporate euphemism, a meeting to discuss new organizational alignments. Mark's office was a sterile glass box on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city I could no longer see as my own. Everything inside was meticulously arranged, from the identical pens on his desk to the abstract painting on the wall meant to project power. There were no personal touches, nothing to suggest the room belonged to a person rather than a corporate function. He greeted me with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, gesturing for me to sit in a chair intentionally lower than his own. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a glossy printout of the new organizational chart across the polished surface of his desk. It was the same one I had seen on the screen, a web of neat lines and boxes that had meticulously erased my entire team. "Sarah," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "As you know, the company is moving towards a more streamlined, synergistic operational model. As part of this evolution, we've made the difficult decision to dissolve the primary research and development department." He paused, likely for effect. "However, the chief executive officer and I recognize your long history with the company. That's why we've created a special consultant role for you. It will allow you to continue providing your expertise on a project basis." He leaned back, the picture of corporate benevolence. But the offer was a profound insult disguised as a favor, a title with no team, a position with no power, and I had no doubt, a salary that reflected their new diminished valuation of my worth. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, watching the confidence in his eyes. He expected gratitude. He expected negotiation, perhaps even tears. I gave him none of it. I simply met his gaze and said with a quiet finality, "No, thank you, Mark. That won't be necessary." For the first time, his professional mask slipped. Just for a second, a flicker of genuine disbelief, quickly followed by annoyance, crossed his face. He had offered the departing queen a place as a servant in the new court, and she had refused the gesture. He recovered quickly, his smile returning with a sharp, dismissive edge. "As you wish," he said, his tone making it clear the offer was rescinded. "Your access credentials will be deactivated by 5 o'clock. Security will escort you from the premises." He expected me to argue. He expected me to plead. Instead, I just nodded, stood up, and walked towards the door. He didn't know that my most important credential, the one that truly granted access to the company's value, was never stored on their servers. It was stored in a fireproof safe in my home office on a piece of paper bearing my signature. The walk out of the building was surreal. The security guard, who had always greeted me with a warm smile, couldn't meet my eyes as he walked me to the main entrance. He held the door open, and as I stepped into the late afternoon air, I felt the finality of the moment settle over me. 15 years of my life, a career I had built from nothing, had just been concluded by an impersonal corporate directive. The drive home was quiet. I didn't feel anger or sadness. What I felt was a profound silence, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. My home office was the complete opposite of Mark's sterile chamber. It was a room filled with history. Bookshelves overflowed with scientific journals. Old prototypes sat on display like cherished sculptures, and faded photographs of my original team were tacked to a corkboard. I began the slow, methodical process of packing, sorting through the memories each item represented. A story they were determined to forget. While clearing out my filing cabinet, I found it. Not by luck, I knew exactly where it was. It was a heavy leather-bound portfolio reserved for documents of immense importance. The gold lettering on the front was simple: incorporation and founding agreements. My fingers traced the words before I opened it. The paper inside was thick, bearing the original signatures of myself and the other co-founders. My eyes scanned past the standard articles, landing on a section near the back, Section 4B. It had a title I had insisted on years ago, the Founder's Clause. I hadn't read it in over a decade, but I remembered its spirit perfectly. It was a fail-safe, a protection for the creators against the business people who might one day forget how the business was created. It stipulated in clear language that should any founding signatory be terminated without due cause and by non-mutual consent, their personal grant of intellectual property rights to the corporation could be at their sole discretion revoked with 30 days written notice. In essence, they couldn't fire the founder and keep the founder's creations without permission. A slow breath escaped my lips. This wasn't a loophole. It was a doorway I had built into the very foundation of the company. A key I had kept for an emergency I never thought would come. They had not just terminated me. They had done so with dismissive arrogance, erasing my department and offering an insulting demoted role. It was the very definition of being terminated without due cause. They had breached the one clause that held everything together. I closed the portfolio slowly, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. I picked up my phone, my hand perfectly steady, and found the number for my lawyer. He was an old friend, someone who had been there from the beginning. He picked up on the second ring. "Sarah, I just heard," he said, his voice full of concern. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be, David," I replied. "I have a question. Do you remember the founder's clause we put into the original licensing agreement?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then a slow whistle. "My God, Sarah," he said. "They didn't." "David," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I believe they've just made a $300 million oversight." David's advice was simple and clear. There would be no emotional back and forth, no angry phone calls, no informal emails that could be ignored. The next step had to be a formal, legally binding notification. We spent the next day drafting the letter, a masterpiece of cold precision, stripped of all emotion, leaving only the hard facts of the contract. We cited Section 4B, the Founders' Clause, and stated my legal position. The letter informed the board I was exercising my right to revoke the license for the company's core intellectual property, giving them a 30-day remediation period. After that, the foundation of their entire operation would be legally withdrawn. The next morning, I drove to the main post office. I didn't just drop the letter in a mailbox. I stood in line and paid for certified mail with a return receipt requested. In an age of fleeting digital messages, I was creating a physical paper trail that could be proven in court. The postal worker stamped the envelopes with a heavy, satisfying thud. It felt less like sending a letter and more like setting a timer on a bomb. 10 identical envelopes were sent to the chief executive officer and each of the 9 board members at their private residences. There would be no plausible deniability. The days that followed were filled with a profound silence. I had expected frantic calls from their legal department, perhaps even a threatening letter, but there was nothing. The lack of response was a power play, a strategic decision to treat my notification as insignificant. They believed by ignoring me, they could make me irrelevant. They didn't understand the contract didn't require their participation, only their notification. The 30-day clock was ticking whether they chose to watch it or not. I didn't check my phone obsessively. I started working in my garden, letting the process unfold as it was designed to. The silence was finally broken a week later by a call from Arthur, one of the original board members, a good man trapped in the new corporate culture. His voice was strained, laced with a panic he was trying to conceal. "Sarah, what in God's name have you done?" "There's a letter." I informed the board of a pre-existing contractual obligation. "Arthur, that's all," I replied calmly. He let out a short, frustrated laugh. "Inform them, Sarah, they aren't taking it seriously." Peterson, the chief executive officer, laughed about it in a senior staff meeting. He called it a bluff. He paused and his voice dropped lower. "And Mark from Human Resources, he made a show of it. He put your certified letter through his office shredder in front of 3 other executives." I thanked him for the information and hung up the phone, a cold stillness settling over me. The arrogance was breathtaking. The shredder was a theatrical, foolish gesture. But in their attempt to display power, they had just made a fatal error. They had provided me with something priceless, a witness to their own willful negligence. When I told David about the shredded letter, his response was immediate. "Willful negligence," he said, his voice calm but sharp. He confirmed they had moved beyond simple arrogance into active recklessness. He explained that by destroying a formal legal notice in front of witnesses, they could no longer claim ignorance or simple error. They had been made aware of a critical risk and had consciously disregarded it, a fact that would be indefensible in any legal setting. His advice was unchanged. Do nothing. Wait. The 30-day clock was still ticking. 2 more weeks passed. From the outside, nothing had changed. The company's stock price was stable, and their press releases were optimistic. To any observer, it would seem their strategy of ignoring me had worked. I continued to tend my garden, finding a certain irony in the fact that while I was cultivating new life, the roots of the company I had built were beginning to rot from a poison of their own making. The first tremor came not from an internal memo, but from across the Atlantic. Arthur called me again, his voice now stripped of all professionalism, replaced by raw panic. "It's the German deal, Sarah," he said, skipping any greeting. "The Munich distribution contract, it's on hold." He explained that their meticulous German partners were renewing a $50 million contract and as part of routine due diligence had requested a currently executed copy of the company's license for the core technology. Of course, the only document my former company could provide was the original agreement bearing my signature. The German team asked for an updated addendum proving the intellectual property was secure after the departure of a founding licensor. My company had nothing to show them. Faced with an unclear chain of ownership, the Germans had immediately put the entire $50 million deal on indefinite hold. For a company like theirs, a contract is a sacred text and the chain of ownership an unbreakable line. Any ambiguity was not a problem to be solved later. It was a foundational flaw that halted everything instantly. Arthur told me the chief executive officer was furious, blaming his legal department for the oversight. Mark, the head of human resources, was reportedly trying to dismiss it as a minor bureaucratic hiccup, assuring everyone it would be sorted out. They were beginning to understand this wasn't an issue that could be solved with a termination form. They were starting to see the ghost they thought they had exorcised. While that fire was starting to burn in their boardroom, I received a quiet, automated email from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I opened it calmly. It was a formal notification. An application filed by my former company just 3 days prior to amend the primary patent license had been reviewed and rejected. The reason for the rejection was listed in cold simple text. Failure to secure the signature of all original listed licensors. They had tried to erase me from a piece of paper in an office meeting. Now they had tried to erase my name from a federal record and they were learning that some signatures don't fade. I forwarded the official rejection notice from the patent office to David with a single line, "For your records." His reply came minutes later. "They are officially building our case for us," he wrote. "Every move they make demonstrates a clear pattern of incompetence and bad faith. We both knew their failed attempt to alter a federal document was more than just another mistake. It was a desperate act that would look terrible in any proceeding. My strategy of quiet, patient pressure was working. The company, through its own panicked actions, was tightening the noose around its own neck. It was only a matter of time before the internal problem became a public one. The news about the stalled German deal finally leaked. A small article appeared in a respected financial journal written by a journalist known for deep industry connections. It didn't mention my name, but it didn't have to. It spoke of a significant European contract delayed due to intellectual property uncertainties and a foundational licensing dispute. The language was cautious, but the implication was clear. The market, which thrives on certainty, reacted instantly. The company's stock, stable for months, took its first noticeable dive, dropping 7% in a single morning. The tremor had become an undeniable earthquake. This external pressure forced the Chief Executive Officer Peterson out of the shadows. He called an emergency all-hands meeting, a recording of which was forwarded to me by a former colleague. I listened as Peterson, his voice tight with forced confidence, blamed the disruption on outdated legacy contracts and the unreasonable demands of a disgruntled former employee. Then Mark, the head of human resources, took the microphone to reassure the staff. "I want to be perfectly clear," he said, his voice booming with false authority. "Our world-class legal team has thoroughly reviewed this frivolous claim and has determined it has absolutely no merit. This is a temporary hiccup and we have the situation under control." He was projecting strength, but I knew it was a performance born of desperation. Just as I finished listening to the recording, my phone rang. It was David. His tone was no longer calm. It was sharp and serious, the voice he used when a new front in a war had opened. "Sarah, I just received a notification from our legal courier," he said. "They tried to serve papers at your home." "What kind of papers?" I asked, my own voice remaining steady. "They're not just calling your claim frivolous in company meetings anymore," he said. "They've made their official move. They have filed a lawsuit against you. They are suing you for corporate extortion." Extortion? It was a bold, aggressive, and foolish move. It was also the move that would give my lawyer the legal authority to demand access to everything they had been trying to hide. They hadn't just sued me. They had handed us the keys to their kingdom. My first reaction to being sued was not fear, but a cold, calculating calm. I told David what I was thinking. "They just gave you the keys," he confirmed, his voice sharp with focus. "This lawsuit is a monumental blunder. Their attempt to intimidate you now legally compels them to participate in the discovery process. They have to turn over emails, minutes, and memos related to your termination and the license. They think they've cornered you, but they've actually invited us into their house to search for evidence." The company, in its arrogance, made the lawsuit public. They issued a press release announcing they were taking legal action against a disgruntled former employee engaging in extortionist tactics. It was a hardball move designed to isolate me and paint me as a greedy villain. But it had the opposite effect. For others who had been pushed out or silenced by the new management, it was a declaration of war, and it inadvertently called them to my side. My phone began to ring. The first calls were from former engineers, brilliant minds who had been part of my team for years before being laid off in Mark's restructuring. "Sarah, we saw the news," one of them said, his voice tight with anger. "It's a lie. We know the truth. We were in the project meetings last year when the legal team flagged the founder's license as a potential risk. We have the email threads." Within hours, my lawyer had a secure anonymous channel set up and the evidence started to trickle in. Proof that their negligence wasn't an oversight, but a calculated risk. Then a more significant call came. It was from Robert, the original chief executive officer who had started the company with me and retired a year after the acquisition. He had been watching from the sidelines, horrified at what was happening to the company they had built together. "I read their press release, Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "They're trying to rewrite our history. That clause was put in there to protect the heart of the company, the creators. I am more than willing to provide a sworn affidavit to that effect. I'll testify in court if it comes to that." His support wasn't just comforting. It was a powerful validation of my entire claim. The final call of the day came from a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as a senior journalist from a major financial newspaper. He said he had been following the story, the stalled German deal, the stock dip, and now the bizarrely aggressive lawsuit. The company's official narrative, he said, just didn't make sense. He wanted to hear the other side of the story. Off the record. I paused, looking out my window at the setting sun. The battle had until now been fought through lawyers and legal notices. This was an invitation to fight in a new arena, the court of public opinion. I agreed to meet him. It was time for the market to understand the difference between a name on a payroll and a name on a patent. My meeting with the journalist resulted in a meticulously researched article that laid out the timeline of events in stark detail. It was balanced, professional, and for the company, it was devastating. The story was no longer about a disgruntled employee. It was about a founding partner, a critical intellectual property dispute, and reckless management. The stock, already wounded, plunged another 15%. The quiet tremor had become a full-blown catastrophe, and the major investors were demanding answers. The summons did not come from a court, but from the chairman of the board himself. It was a formal request for me and my legal counsel to attend an emergency board meeting. The power dynamic had shifted. They were no longer suing me into silence. They were forced to listen. We met in the main boardroom, a place built for intimidation with its long mahogany table and a wall of glass overlooking the city. I sat with David on one side of that table. Across from us sat the chief executive officer, Peterson, looking pale and exhausted, his usual corporate swagger gone. Beside him, Mark, the head of human resources, shuffled papers, refusing to make eye contact. The 9 members of the board were arranged around them, their faces grim, unreadable masks of concern. The air was thick with a tension you could almost taste. The chairman began, his voice low and grave, stating the purpose of the meeting was to understand the root cause of the current crisis. He then turned to me. "Miss Connolly, we are here to listen." I didn't speak. I simply gave a small, deliberate nod to David. He stood up, his movements calm and methodical, his voice even and measured. He laid out the chain of events. He presented the timeline of my termination, the certified letters, the sworn statement about the shredded letter, the email from the German partners, and the rejection notice from the patent office. He presented the evidence our anonymous allies had provided. He wasn't arguing or accusing. He was simply constructing a fortress of facts, brick by undeniable brick. When he finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. The board members looked from the documents David had distributed to the ashen-faced CEO. Finally, the most powerful investor on the board, a formidable woman who had built her reputation on shrewd, unsentimental decisions, spoke for the first time. Her gaze was fixed solely on Peterson. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice quiet, but cutting through the silence like glass. "I have a simple yes or no question for you. Did you or did you not have knowledge that Miss Connolly's name was on the foundational license when you and Mr. Logan authorized her termination?" The silence that followed was heavier than any financial report. It was the sound of a king being checkmated by a ghost. Peterson didn't answer the question, not with words, but his silence was a confession. A dark flush crept up his neck and his eyes darted around the room looking for an escape he could not find. He opened his mouth, but only a dry clicking sound came out. The formidable investor who had asked the question simply stared back at him, her expression turning from inquiry to icy contempt. In that moment, every person on that board knew the truth. They had been led into a catastrophe by a chief executive officer who was either grossly negligent or had deliberately concealed a catastrophic risk. The meeting did not end. It fractured. The chairman abruptly declared it adjourned. The investors pushed their chairs back and formed a tight, anxious huddle in the corner of the room, pointedly turning their backs on Peterson and Mark. David and I gathered our papers without a word. There was nothing more to say. We had presented the facts and the facts had done their work. As we walked out of that room, leaving the senior leadership to implode under the weight of their own decisions, I knew the company's fate was sealed. They had been given 30 days to fix their mistake. Their time was now up. The next morning, I was in my home office as the sun began to rise. The 30th day had passed. There had been no last-minute calls, no desperate settlement offers, only the chaotic silence of a leadership team in freefall. At precisely 8:30, I made a single phone call to David. Proceed, I said. That was all that was needed. At 9 o'clock, a press statement prepared by my lawyer was released to all major financial news outlets. It was brief, professional, and final. It announced that as of that moment, pursuant to the terms of the foundational licensing agreement, the intellectual property license for the company's core technology had been officially and irrevocably revoked. It further stated that any continued manufacturing, sale, or distribution of their primary products would now constitute a willful violation of my intellectual property rights. The timer had reached 0. My phone was quiet for about 15 minutes. Then it rang. I looked at the screen. It was Peterson's private number. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice calm. Yes. The voice on the other end was a broken whisper, the arrogant titan from the boardroom now reduced to a man on the edge of a cliff. Sarah, he stammered, his voice trembling with a desperation I had never heard before. Please, just tell us what you want. It's too late for that, Peterson, I said, and calmly ended the call. It was never about what I wanted. It was about what they had done. The fallout was immediate and absolute. With their core technology license revoked, all production lines ground to a halt. Shipments were frozen at ports and the company's stock was suspended from trading before it could fall to 0. The chief executive officer and the head of human resources were terminated by the board before noon that same day. The house they had managed so poorly had finally collapsed. The board approached me a week later, not with threats or lawsuits, but with a desperate offer of an obscene amount of money to reinstate the license. I refused. It was never about the money. Instead, I laid out my own terms. I would grant the license not to them, but to a new restructured company that would rise from the ashes of the old one with a renewed focus on ethical research and our original mission. I would not be an employee. I would take a seat on the new board as a founding partner, a permanent guardian of its soul. They agreed to everything. Months later, I walked through the doors of the reborn company. The name on the wall was new, a name that spoke of innovation and integrity. They didn't just forget my name. They thought my name had lost its power. They learned that a signature on a founding document is more than ink on paper. It is the cornerstone. And you cannot remove a cornerstone without bringing the entire house down. This story is a reminder that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the most powerful. True strength is often found in the quiet, deliberate moves made while others are focused on the noise. It's in the foundations you build and the value you know you hold, even when others choose to forget it. If you have ever felt undervalued or have quietly planned your exit from a place that no longer deserved your talent, know that you are not alone. If this story spoke to you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who's still finding their own.